Yeah, I think it extends to Europe too. I don't think we're giving anyone. The Europeans are now in what must be for them the realization of a nightmare. The European countries, like Israel, got into bed, hitched their wagon, became dependent on the United States as their military protector, as their economic partner, as their political guarantor. And we now have a leader who has every interest in breaking from all of that. He's going to make a deal with Mr. Putin. They kind of see it coming. And it'll be a deal to end the war in Ukraine, or at least suspend it. And every major leader in Europe has hitched his or her wagon to being supportive in Ukraine. The only exceptions, and they're not much of one, but the only exceptions are, the Hungarians and the Czechs a little bit and so on. But the others are all doing this. And that's why you're seeing, Mr. Macron in France, he's got no approval. He's a political dead weight. He has no future. It's even more pathetic to watch Mr. Starmer in England running around trying to keep going a war in which he was always a junior partner and had no real influence. Mr. Schultz, who's already on his way out because he made that mistake. By the way, I noticed that Mr. Schultz, in order to get any leverage for his election, has to become anti-Trump. I don't know if you caught him. He's so desperate that he's trying to switch in midstream. I don't think it will fool very many German voters. It might, but I don't think so. Too little, too late. He denounced Mr. Trump for wanting to take over other territory. That's very strange. You're fighting Mr. Putin for taking over territory. What? Suddenly, your great ally is talking about more territory involving more people than anything going on in Ukraine. It is bizarre what these people and economically, look at them. Europe is sinking between the United States on one hand and China on the other, and it's a process that is becoming obvious. We have our high tech. The Chinese match us. The Europeans, nothing, nowhere. I noticed that my friend Yanis Varoufakis goes around Europe explaining, as a European economist and a European political leader, because he happens to be both, that he refers to Europe, his continent, as stupid. I mean, it's extraordinary. He's a very smart man. I know him pretty well. I read his work, and but they only won, just like he was the only one who understood that bailing out Greece wasn't bailing out Greece. It was bailing out the French and British and German banks who are owed a lot of money, which the government gave, the European government gave to the Greek government on condition that we'd use it to pay back the banks. It was Europe taking care of Europe at Greece's expense, routing the money through. And he had at least the courage to say so, which is why they had to get rid of him. I mean, you couldn't even allow it to be said. But I think that's a crisis building very quick. I think you're going to see real political turmoil in Europe because the existing, just like here, the existing Democrats and Republicans prepared the way for Mr. Trump's theater. You're seeing that same process in Europe. And whether the new face comes from the left, which is what you have in France, or it comes from the right, which is what you have in Germany, you're going to see the same basic story unfolding. and it's going to be another nail in the coffin of the American empire, because its junior partner, Europe, is going to become a tremendous problem and not much of an ally.
I think you're right, Richard, that the focus of what's considered to be the war in Ukraine has been Europe all along. The war in Ukraine has not weakened Russia. If anything, as we've discussed, it strengthened it. But what it has done is amazingly weakened Europe. Now, I don't think it's possible for any agreement to be made between Trump and Putin to settle the Ukrainian situation, because the war is still on. When one side is winning a war, as Russia's finally just cleaning up the Ukrainian army, there cannot be any such thing as a ceasefire or any plan for a post-war settlement, because the settlement has to be made on the battlefield, not diplomatically. So all that Trump can do is say, we're not going to spend any more American money on Ukraine. That will be what he's doing. And what he said is more. You've had his one of his cabinet ministers saying that if Europe really feels what the NATO leader has said, if America loses the war against Russia in Ukraine, that Putin will march right through to the Atlantic Ocean and destroy Europe. And so a loss, settling the fighting in Ukraine in anything less than a total NATO victory is a total European loss. So the Trump cabinet has said, well, if that's the case, if you want money and you want American support, you've got to buy enormous amounts of treasury bills. And in fact, you've got to pay the war in Ukraine. What Trump says is, this is not our war against Russia. We want peace. This is Europe's war against Russia. Europe and NATO countries in Europe should pay for the war, not us. And of course, how do you pay for a war? Well, you need arms. And Europe's arms industry has been destroyed by the United States sanctions against Russia. And so this means, as we've discussed before here, I think in the 2 weeks while you were gone, an enormous payment to the United States by Europe, a reduction in the euro's exchange rate and a rise in the dollar's value against Europe. You're having that especially now that the Federal Reserve here has been raising its interest rates to 4.8% for 10-year treasuries. There's an enormous inflow into the dollar and a rising dollar. Trump, I want to talk a bit about this balance of payments dimension of the war, because this is going to be where a lot of the squeeze on the Trump administration foreign policy is going to come. Trump has said, I think incorrectly, that he wants a low dollar value so that will make American exports less expensive. He's living in the past. That was the case when American industry was competing with European and Asian and other industry. That's not the case anymore. We're deindustrialized. The rest of the world is dependent on U.S. oil and U.S. farm products. And it doesn't matter what the exchange rate is. They have to pay whatever the price is. The actual effect of Trump's policies is going to say America has to be the financial winner. Imagine if America puts the tariffs that Trump has promised on against Europe, not to mention Canada and Mexico. That's going to reduce America's imports and increase the balance of trade to further strengthen the dollar. Everything that Trump is trying to do to help, what he says, help the American economy, is going to raise the price of the dollar against foreign currencies so much that this is going to destabilize the entire international financial system. For instance, if the dollar goes up against the global south countries, their debts are in dollars, but their ability to pay the debts is in their own currency. They will have to spend much more of their domestic budget to pay the dollar debts that they have, or they'll have to default. The same problem is going to happen in Europe. If Europe pays what President Trump is insisting that they pay for NATO, for U.S. arms, for tariffs that are imposed on them, then they're going to have to drastically cut back spending. Well, a few days ago, the military, one of the military advisors of, I think, the German government said, we need, instead of a bank for social spending, given the fact that the German constitution says you can't run a budget deficit beyond a marginal amount, we have to have a NATO war bank. They've actually suggested that Europe set up a special NATO war bank to attract savings, paying high interest rates in order to afford to spend the money on NATO, the 5% of GDP. This is paying 5% of the GDP for war against Russia and Ukraine is the equivalent of a 4 percentage point decline in GDP. This means that Europe will impose upon itself, or will be imposed by Trump, the equivalent of the 1929 crash in the United States. Europe will be broke. Well, I can imagine many of Trump's supporters saying, this is great. We're billionaires. We can come in and buy Europe industry cheap. We can buy European companies cheap. It's as if from Europe's perspective and the perspective of many American investors, the Ukraine war is all about checkmating Europe and permitting a huge takeover, given the illusion in Europe that Russia is going to invade and is somehow threatening Europe by exporting gas and oil and making it more dependent. This crazy narrative that is official policy that obviously is pushed by the American politicians over there is going to make Europe the most unstable of all of the areas that we've talked about, even Mexico and the Near East. Although I guess you could say there's going to be chaos everywhere in the next 6 months.
Well, the issue of Europe, let me expand a little bit to make sure that people understand what Michael just said. The exchange rate between the dollar and the euro was about $1.02 for a euro the last 2 or 3 days. It may be $1.03 now. That is already extremely low. It means that all a European gets when a European wants to exchange euros for dollars is $1.02 for each euro. Well, that's a lot less than you could get for a euro over most of the last 20 years. This is a very big deal, especially if it drops, which it has very rarely done and not for long, below parity. But that's where it seems to be headed. And that means, relative to the history, Europe is in terrible trouble because it does, particularly Germany, it depends on exports. And it's not attractive because of what the euro isn't worth. This is a serious problem for them. with or without having to pay for the Ukraine war if it continues. But let's assume that Michael is right, and I think it points that way, that we're not going to get a quick end to the Ukraine war, although Mr. Trump will try for it, but we won't get it. The Europeans have boxed themselves in. They're committed to this. Their political careers depend on it, but they are destroying their own economic viability. If the United States acts, as Trump has said, to spend much less money on the war in Ukraine, which has already happened in the last year of Mr. Biden because of Republican opposition in the Congress, then the Europeans are going to be in an incredible place. They either have to go along with a deal in Ukraine that makes all of their pronouncements about the life and death look like the theater it always was. That's a death knell for their own political survival. If, on the other hand, they have to pay much more for the war, they will not be able to do that and afford their social welfare system. And if they cut that, which they've been doing, they're going to provoke the extreme left and the extreme right, which has already happened. The extreme left in France, the extreme right in Germany. And that's going to undo them politically, which means we have an either or whose net result is the same either way. They cannot survive. They cannot go to their people who are already unhappy with the Ukraine war, barely supporting them, and say it's now going to cost you your pension. That would be Mr. Macron. Or a whole host of social services. That was Schultz. They can't do that. It's not a viable arrangement. And there's no golden miracle that's going to come down the road and save them, because the whole world is industrializing in place of Europe. This is a very weird situation. And notice that the emerging bloc in the world economy, BRICS, is noteworthy because it's not about Europe. Europe is outside the story. The BRICS is the global south. There was a rumor, I believe it's true, that a year or two ago, Mr. Macron actually inquired whether France could join the BRICS. And he was told, no, thank you. Meanwhile, Indonesia, one of the largest countries in the world, population 280 million people. That's not much smaller than the United States. Join the BRICS. I mean, the writing is on the wall. You have to be blind not to see. This is not good for Europe, and Europe remains the chief ally of the United States. It is destroying its own allies, and it can't figure out a way not to do it, and it is irritated with obstacles to doing that. And I think you're going to see growing anxiety in Europe if Mr. Trump is able to achieve even a small part of the only way forward he sees. This is an accumulation. I know this is beating the dead horse, but we have to. This is an accumulation of problems that haven't been solved. The problem of the dollar, the problem of balance of payments, the problem of internal productivity, the problem of changing global trade patterns, and above all, the emergence of China and its allies with their own agenda, who are not held back by the kinds of problems that are affecting the West. And that's the story of the decline of one global regime and the emergence of another. We are living through that. But we shouldn't be so focused on each of the little steps at risk of losing the larger picture.
Well, since you pointed out all these complications, I might as well add another one. There's one country that's just off the coast of Maine politically, and that's Great Britain. You've had the British Prime Minister Sturmer try to start a war with Russia and Azerbaijan by going to Armenia and trying to sign a contract with Armenia and to essentially open a new military front in Armenia against Azerbaijan and Russia with the intention of stopping the oil pipeline and Belt and Road initiative that Russia and China are trying to extend westward. What will the United States and Trump do about Britain's essentially, Britain is doing what Netanyahu is doing. It is trying to force America into a war with a larger power, just like Netanyahu wants to drag America into war with Iran. England wants to drag the United States into a war with Russia and Azerbaijan, and probably spreading to Turkey as well. I would imagine that if Putin and Trump sit down, one of the first things that Putin is going to say about, well, you know, you're talking about stopping aggression, but right now your English puppet is accelerating its aggression in Armenia. How can you stop that? This is going to be a complicated factor that I think can blow up just as much as Europe. I don't consider England, Britain to be really part of Europe politically. And I think Europe has no desire ever to absorb Britain in, but I just wanted to fill out all of the complicating chaos areas that we've discussed.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to tell you, you know, it underscores that we are living at a time of mounting global, multiple economic problems that are the result of a failure to deal with them for quite a while. And now they are, how shall I put it, reinforcing or feeding one another. So that what you can't do in Central Asia worsens your problem in Europe or vice versa. And what you can't do, you know, in Canada or Mexico makes other problems you have that much worse. The grandiose notion of deporting tens of millions of people, it's extraordinary. The very idea of doing that, no matter what happens, shows you these are very extreme problems if you're thinking in these kinds of extreme terms about how to solve them. Even before you get to the feasibility, look at the language, look at the tone of what it is you're going to do. And if his judicial appointments wage a revenge war against Democrats, if that part of the theater is taken seriously, then we're back to the point that Michael made earlier, that the internal struggles in this society add a whole nother uncertainty as to the outcome of all of this. There's no reason to expect that this country will be any further along in solving its problems after 4 more years of Trump than it was after the first 4 years of Trump or the next 4 years of Biden. Nothing is happening here that gives you the reason, a sense, we're going to be dealing with these problems in an effective way.
If only things were that solvable, Richard. I don't think these are problems. They're quandaries. A problem has a solution. A quandary doesn't. In a quandary, you're stuck. There's nothing that you can do to solve the problem as it's formulated, as it exists. And the way that we've been